Hey everybody, welcome back to Family Friday. I am George Willett, and we are in our study on Jesus. Now last week we started this study. It was the first lesson, and we said that we're going to answer a lot of questions about Jesus. Like, who is Jesus, and is he God or man? What's the incarnation? All the way down to, how does Jesus' death on the cross pay for my sins? And how do I accept him? Like, okay, so Jesus did all this for me. How do I actually have a relationship with him? These are all important questions. And like I said, we've done so much study. We've done good study. But I thought we really should kind of focus and hone in on Jesus. And today, this lesson is called The Historical Jesus. And what I'm going to do here, this is a little different. It's a little weird. I want to talk about the things that people agree about Jesus, even if they don't believe in Jesus. So this is not just Christian scholarship, not just Christian authors and scholars and academics, but non-Christians. And they say this is the stuff we can generally agree about Jesus on. And why is this important? Because we're living in an age where more and more and more on social media, on popular books, people are saying stuff like, well, Jesus never really existed. He's a myth. He was made up after the fact. And because that's so popular and because people say it online with such conviction, well, there was never really a man named Jesus, people believe it, but it's not true. So I'm not even going to get into the Bible today. I just want to talk about, if we look in history, if we do a historical study, what are the things that almost everyone who actually studies this agrees on? So who is Jesus? This historical Jesus, there's a guy, his name's Gary Habermas. He is a Christian, and he specializes in the study of the resurrection and the historical Jesus. In fact, he wrote a book, The Historical Jesus. Here's what he says. There are very few scholars that hold the view that Jesus never lived. Even Rudolf Bultmann, this is a non-Christian academic scholar. Even this guy, Rudolf Bultmann, said, by no means are we at the mercy of those who doubt or deny that Jesus ever lived. That's on page 27. Now think about it, a non-Christian saying, listen, all of this stuff that's going out there that Jesus never existed, we don't even have to worry about that. We're not going to listen to that because that's bad scholarship. And then there's another scholar. This guy's name is Bart Ehrman. And he wrote a book, Did Jesus Exist? Now, I need to tell you a couple things about Bart Ehrman. Bart is a scholar, a New Testament first century historian. He has a lot of expertise, and he used to be a Christian. And then as he was studying and as he was getting into his research, he became an agnostic. And I think today he calls himself kind of an agnostic atheist. He's not 100% sure, but he kind of leans to the fact that there's no God out there. And part of it is Dr. Ehrman does not believe that miracles can happen. So he discounts any report of a miracle, and he's like, okay, that's made up because miracles don't happen. So it's really hard for him to look at the evidence and even consider the possibility that there's a God and that Jesus is someone who did miracles, even though he says, yes, that's what people say about him. So here's some quotes from him. From page 12 of Did Jesus Exist? He said, despite the enormous range of opinion, and there are several points on which virtually all scholars of antiquity agree. So what he's saying is, even though people have a bunch of different opinions about Jesus specifically, almost everyone who actually studies this agrees on these points. Jesus was a Jewish man, known to be a preacher and a teacher, and that he was crucified, a Roman form of execution, in Jerusalem during the reign of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, and he was crucified when Pontius Pilate was the governor of Judea. Okay, now I want you to hold that just for a second. A non-Christian, someone who does not believe that Jesus was God in the flesh, does not believe that there's a God, still says the basic facts that we read in the Gospels are accurate history. That this is who Jesus was. But he doesn't end there. He goes on, and there's a couple of different page quotes here. He says, it's fair to say that the mythicists, this is a group of people who believe Jesus didn't really exist. He says, as a group and as individuals, are not taken seriously by the vast majority of scholars in the field of New Testament, early Christianity, ancient history, and theology. So I've actually heard quotes from him where he said, people that believe Jesus was a myth are taken as seriously as people who believe the earth is flat. People don't think they take scholarship seriously. They don't understand the real historical text. They don't understand what they're talking about. They're just making claims. In fact, he goes on, and this is a little bit later in the book, he says, the idea that Jesus did not exist is a modern notion. It has no ancient precedents. It was made up in the 18th century, a couple hundred years ago. And he says one might as well call it a modern myth, the myth of the mythical Jesus. Please don't misunderstand this. And please, just because I'm not in the Bible today, don't gloss over how important this kind of research is. Again, in America today, more and more people are trying to pull people out of faith in Jesus. They're trying to minimize the role that Jesus plays. They're trying to blunt Christianity and the claims of Christianity. So I disagree with some of the conclusions that people like Bart Ehrman or Rudolf Bultmann will come to the person of Jesus. But the thing we all can agree on is that what we cannot say and what no one can say and be taken serious is that Jesus wasn't a real person. That Jesus didn't exist. And I'm going to want to get into more detail later about other scholarship. But here are the generally accepted facts about Jesus. So in Gary Habermas's book, he's got a section where he's like, okay, when you look at all the scholarship, when you look at not the biblical text, but you look at historical non-Christian stuff, here's what almost everyone, like 90 some odd % of scholarship agrees on. That Jesus died by crucifixion. Jesus was buried in Jerusalem. That Jesus' death left his followers hopeless, dejected. They were not expecting him to die, and when he did, they were crushed. But Jesus' tomb was found empty after a few days. Again, that's what historians agree was happening. Number 5, that Jesus' followers believed that they saw a risen Jesus. Even secular scholars who will not accept that the resurrection could take place, they don't believe in miracles, they said, but yes, all the evidence is that Jesus' followers definitely believed this, that Jesus' followers went out and proclaimed and taught that Jesus rose from the dead. In fact, the thing they agree on is Jesus' followers not only proclaimed it, but they boldly proclaimed that he died, he was resurrected, and they started that proclamation in Jerusalem, the place where he died. The message was this message was at the very center of all preaching for the early church. This is what Christianity is built on. The truth claims of Jesus. It's why in the Bible, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the Apostle Paul says that if Jesus didn't resurrect, if he wasn't resurrected, if he didn't raise from the dead, then we who believe that are without hope. It's foolishness then. There's nothing to our faith if this didn't really happen. So what does it mean that the apostles were teaching this message boldly in Jerusalem, the very place where Jesus was killed and buried? That if it wasn't true, the early opponents of Jesus, of Christianity, could have gone and said, there's the body. But they never did. There's other stories of why the apostles believed it, but no one ever produced the dead body of Jesus. So the church preached this and the church grew. The other things is the message was especially preached again in Jerusalem right after Jesus died and was buried there. Like I said, this is important because if I'm saying Jesus died and this group over here says we killed him and they know where the body's buried, go get the body. And they didn't. Number 9, because of this message, the church was born and it grew. Now, this may not be convincing for a lot of people today, but if you think about it from first century eyes and the context, I'm preaching in Jerusalem about this Jesus who everyone remembers just a couple months ago we killed and buried. But his followers are saying he rose from the dead. And that message grows there. What did those people experience? What did they see? What did they know? And what was the evidence that the apostles were preaching this? And they were like, okay, this makes sense. Because again, we can't find the dead body. Also, they agree that Sunday became the primary day of worship, that people who are Jewish and were very Jewish in how they lived, all of a sudden took their primary day of worship from the Sabbath on Saturday to Sunday worship. Now, some people think it's interesting, but it actually tells us about the commitment of these people, how deeply their experiences and their faith, their trust in the raised Jesus affected how they lived their lives in a way that was totally transformational. It was radical. These facts actually mean a lot. They're very convincing. The other two is that James, the brother of Jesus, was originally very much a doubter of Jesus being the Messiah, the Christ, the chosen one. But he had an experience with a resurrected Jesus that caused him to become a believer. Well, why does that matter? Because, again, it's more of this evidence that something really happened. That there's evidence because of experiences and transformed lives that people who knew who Jesus really was proclaimed they really saw Jesus after his death and burial. That's pretty good testimony. But it doesn't end there, because they also agree that Paul, a man who was called Saul, was an early persecutor of this new faith, that he hunted down believers in Jesus Christ, himself became a believer after he had an experience that he said was an appearance of the risen Jesus. Now, some internet atheist will say, well, that is not a claim of James or of Paul. That is just what's written in the Bible about them. But you see, that's not true. The books that are written in the Bible, and we've talked about it in previous studies, are attestable, they're verifiable. There's good reason to believe that the people who claim to have written them are the people that wrote them. They weren't made up hundreds of years later by people who were using James or Paul's name. We have for us eyewitness testimony. We have the proclamation of these truths in non-scriptural text. This is what the early first century people believed about Jesus and his followers. So again, it may not be convincing to everyone, and that's okay. But I want you as a believer, if you are a believer watching this, I want you to have the sureness that your faith is rooted not just in myth. That's what people want us to believe. It's actually rooted in history. And we can see this because of what historical scholars agree to. Next week, I want to talk about the biblical Jesus. Like, okay, this is what we can do away from the Bible. What if we add the Bible in? What does it actually tell us about the person of Jesus? Because, please remember this, we studied this when we were doing apologetics. You can go back and look at those videos. I did a whole series on, can I trust the Bible to be accurate? And the Bible, the biblical text, especially the New Testament text about Jesus, have been proven again and again and again to be historically reliable. So I didn't add them in because I just want to make sure I'm proving my point. But the fact is, when I read the Bible, I'm also reading history. All right, I hope this helps. I hope it moves us just a little bit closer to understanding who the real Jesus is. God bless. I'll see you next week.